I think there's a fallacy at the notion that militant multiculturalism is a liberal view. It's not a liberal view. It's really a view of the New Left of the 1960s. And if you remember the 1960s, the New Left regarded liberals as their main enemy. They weren't worried about conservatives. But the New Left and the radicals of the 60s were very much opposed to liberals. This is a book that most liberals wholly agree with. It's the aging radicals of the 1960s and their equivalents in the 1990s who feel that to talk about one people is injustice, and who want to perpetuate ethnic and religious and racial differences. They're bound to lose, Brian. I think the most telling statistics is the rate of intermarriage. Marriage across ethnic lines, marriage across religious lines, marriage across racial lines. More Japanese Americans marry Caucasians than marry other Japanese Americans. So many Jewish Americans marry non-Jews that people are worried about the future of a Jewish community, of a Jewish identity. The black-white marriages have quadrupled over the last generation. And the attitude toward what used to be called miscegenation has been absolutely transformed. So I have confidence that love or sex will defeat those in the end who want to disunite America.
Welcome to another episode of Malvo Talks. I am Ethan Malvo. The topic of today's broadcast is going to be the Disuniting of America, which is written, those of you on the podcast cannot see this, which is written by the famous Harvard University historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I want to welcome also those who are going to be listening to me by way of the Green Cheese Network, and also by those who will be listening by way of podcasts. Anyway, these two episodes, because this is going to be part one, these two will mark the end of season 2 of Malvo Talks. And with this subject matter, I just wanted to tackle the divisiveness and the divisiveness of America today. And this book gives me a good context and contours by which the nation is falling apart and balkanizing, and tackles very straightforwardly the situation that has developed culturally. And I'm just going to improvise around 3 points in this book. And in the part 2 of the Disuniting of America, I am going to broaden out what Arthur Schlesinger has put on the table with selected essays by 2 other intellectuals and historians, but intellectuals more so. Anyway, I want to first tackle the 3 topics that I have gleaned out of this book. And in teasing these topics out, I am going to first talk about what he said in terms of racism, and then I'm going to get into the topics of, I just don't want to say cultural, but really ethnocentric topics. First, in terms of immigration and amalgamation, the melting pot as it is commonly euphemized. And the other thing is the Afrocentric studies because he talks about Dr. Leonard Jeffries and his impact. And so I'm just going to first start with what he has to say about racism in general. And then we'll go to these other topics. And here he says, page 18 in his book, we must face the shameful fact. Historically, America has been a racist nation. White Americans began as a people so arrogant in convictions of racial superiority that they felt licensed to kill red people, to enslave black people, to import yellow and brown people for peon labor. We white Americans, and notice he's saying this even as a Jew. He says, we white Americans have been racist in our laws, in our institutions, in our customs, in our conditioned reflexes, in our souls. The curse of racism has been the great failure of the American experiment, the glaring contradiction of American ideals, and the still crippling disease of American life. The world's fairest hope, wrote Herman Melville, linked with man's foulest crime. And here, he's hit the nail right on the head. In spite of what has been called by the mainstream and by the media, the civil rights movement, which in truth was an insurrection, as James Baldwin said. In spite of all of that, the races are still fundamentally divided. We can window dress, we can, talk about famous hip-hop stars and celebrities and all of that, but the main divisions, racially speaking, are still there. After 50 years, they are still there. And don't give me any of this, well, we've come a long way. The black people of 1874 could say that. What does that mean in practicality? Especially when you see how apathetic the political structure is in terms of any kind of meaningful police reform, or better yet, incursion into having a resolution to police brutality. See, we still have this, even under the black president, we had this. And things seem to be drifting now. There is this acknowledgement that we have no a fixed solution or sure solution to this problem, which illustrates that the descendants of slaves are still second-class citizens. There was Lyndon Johnson who said quite perceptively that we cannot focus on the black stars. We have to, and this is echoing the prognosis of the first black senator, Senator Hiram Revels, way back in the 1870. He said that it does not matter how well behaved you are, how well spoken, or how well mannered you may be. The prejudice against you is just as great as it is against the most low and degraded colored man. In other words, in spite of all of your accomplishment, you can still be treated like a dog. See, the celebrities, even those who are men and women of color, that's a 1 in a million shot. The rank and file of people of color are never going to have that kind of lifestyle. The LeBron Jameses and everything, Tiger Woods, see, people like this, Michael Jordan, they're never going to experience that kind of celebrity and fame. And at the end of the day, the average person of color has got to feel that the country loves him and respects him. And that is something that continues on to this day without being seriously tackled, addressed, and solved. Now we're going to move on to, but let me do it this way. What he has to say in terms of Dr. Leonard Jeffries, and then we'll wrap up with the immigration debate. But anyway, in his chapter, History, the Weapon, he talks about Dr. Leonard Jeffries this way. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Leonard Jeffries was one of the pioneers of the Afrocentrist curriculum in schools. And here he says, on page 73, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, the task force's consultant on African American culture and a leading author of the report, discerns deep-seated pathologies of racial hatred even in the 1987 education curriculum. A provocative teacher at City College of New York, Jeffries describes Europeans as cold, individualistic, materialistic, and aggressive ice people, quote unquote, who grew up in caves and have brought the world the 3Ds: domination, destruction, and death. Whereas Africans who grew up in sunlight with the intellectual and physical superiority provided by melanin are warm, humanistic, and communitarian sun people, quote unquote. He also tells his CCNY classes that rich Jews financed the slave trade. I am going to skip ahead and say this. Now, huddling, now this is how he frames this. Huddling is an understandable reaction for any minority group faced with new and scary challenges. But institutionalized separatism only crystallizes racial differences and magnifies racial tensions. Certain activities are labeled white and black, says a black student at Central Michigan University. If you don't just participate in black activities, you are shunned, quote unquote. A recent study by the black anthropologist Signithia Fordham of Rutgers concludes that a big reason for black underachievement is the fear that academic success will be taken as a sellout to the white world. What appears, this is her quoting, what appears to have emerged in some segments of the black community, Fordham says, is a kind of cultural orientation which defines academic learning in school as acting white. Militants further argue that because only blacks can comprehend the black experience, only blacks should teach black history and literature, as in the view of some feminists, only women should teach women's history and literature. True diversity, according to the Faculty Budget Committee at the University of California at Berkeley, requires that courses match the ethnic and gender identities of the professors. Henry Louis Gates criticizes ghettoized programs where students and members of the faculty sit around and argue about whether a white person can think a black thought. Now that's his entire quote. As for the notion that there is a mystique about, quote unquote, mystique about black studies that requires a person to have black skin in order to pursue them, that, John Hope Franklin observed succinctly, is voodoo.
In your book, you talk about the African-American baseline essays. What were they or what are they?
Well, they're a series of essays which were published some years ago as part of the Afrocentric movement. These essays attempt to show that most good things in the world originated in Africa. They talk about the glories of African kingdoms and so on. They're a gross form of ethnic cheerleading. They're rejected by most thoughtful black historians. But they had a vogue. I think people of good heart, generous intention, felt that if this made young black students study harder, if it made them feel better, why not use this as a basis for reform changes in the curriculum? So that a number of cities for a while played around with one version or another of the Afrocentric curriculum, influenced by these standard books, treatises to which you were referring. I think the vogue is past, partly because of the leadership of black intellectuals who feel that this is not the way to deal with the question. Partly because there's no clear relationship between academic performance and the question of self-esteem and glorification. Self-esteem really comes from achievement. It's not a cause of achievement. It's a consequence of achievement. And I've never noticed that telling Greek Americans about the glory that was Greece, Greek American kids, or Italian American kids about the grandeur that was Rome, improved their academic performance.
Now, here you have the argument against Leonard Jeffries, because here he uses quite adeptly the two most eminent black historians of modern times, both Henry Louis Gates and the late, great John Hope Franklin, who are saying that the curriculum that Leonard Jeffries is a pioneer in engineering is at its best simple-minded, and at its worst is demagoguery. In the terms of, it is setting up a pathology where white people or Asian people or anybody else that is not of the historical or academic subject that you are teaching, somebody that is not ethically attached to that subject, doesn't have any business teaching that subject. So if you want to learn about black studies, you have to learn from a black teacher. And if you want to know about women's studies, you have to learn from a female. And if you want to know about what you have now, gay studies, you got to learn from a gay teacher. See, all of these things make no sense in what the academy has traditionally been in the West, predating the imposition of the color line. Because what it's saying is that scholarship, which is divorced from a person's ethnicity or ethnic background, has no legitimacy in the modern framework of education. And they're saying that's just a lot of crapola. Anybody, it's the same way in terms of any subject that you teach and study. You know, you don't have to be a European to know your European history. And you don't have to be Chinese to have a command of the history of China for the past 4,000 years. See, these are things that you need to understand in order to have a focus about the crisis that American education is truly in. See, people don't have, and that's what he's saying here in this book, people don't have the common sense to be able to dissect and make the proper dichotomies in order to pinpoint what the problem is with the way in which we construct a curriculum by which people are supposed to not only adhere to a common set of knowledge, but also a common set of values. A common set of principles is an even better way of framing what the general crisis is. Also, not to run down Dr. Leonard Jeffries, having made this statement or having made this argument about what is erroneous and illegitimate in Dr. Jeffries' curriculum, he does not afford Dr. Jeffries the, I think, proper context wherein you must understand that what Dr. Jeffries, the great benefit of what Dr. Jeffries was trying to do, along with John Henry Clark and others, was give, Dr. Chancellor Williams, was give African Americans a self-esteem, however contrived, but nevertheless a self-esteem by which they could overcome the shackles that this culture, the American culture, and the white society by which that culture has not only been appendage to and been at the service of, to the expense of the African American, both as a slave and as a free man and woman, free person, has been subjected to. You just cannot start treating, you know, it's almost like battered women syndrome, you know, a person that has been abused for so many years is not going to have self-esteem automatically. No, that has to be instilled in some way. And because Americans are so short-sighted, as well as simple, I don't want to say it this way, but simple-minded in their approach to the problems, sorrows, and troubles of the African American. I mean, there has been no real deep exploration and resolution of the troubled burdens of being black in America. And this is what Leonard Jeffries really represented. But the fact that Arthur Schlesinger continues to, throughout the book, harpage on Leonard Jeffries. He's already made his case, which was a quite strong case against Leonard Jeffries, but, he keeps harpaging on the arrogance and the presumption of Leonard Jeffries in his convictions. But, see, this is why I had to start with what Schlesinger has to say about the overall treatment of African Americans, while he concedes this point, that black people have suffered at the hands of a white majority. He nevertheless can't figure out why Leonard Jeffries continues to have so much cachet among various people of color. And even though he cites eminent black historians in condemning the curriculum, he must understand that much in the same vein as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, it was something that was needed and may still be needed in order to get through to people who have been abused by the American system, that you count, you have a great destiny, and you come from a great people. And to abridge off of that, I'll put it that way, yet even as audiences cheered the melting pot, one had only to stroll around the great cities, as Basil March did in William Dean Howell's A Hazard of New Fortunes, to see that the melting process was incomplete. Ethnic minorities were forming their own quarters in which they lived in their own way. Not quite that of the lands they had left, but not that of Anglo-centric America either. Little Italy, Chinatown, Yorkville, Harlem, and so on. Was such a result desirable? Many immigrants doubtless thought so. In the early 20th century, most of their children certainly did. But soon ethnic spokesmen began to appear, moved by real concern for distinctive ethnic values and also by real, if unconscious, vested interest in the preservation of the ethnic constituencies. The impression grew that the melting pot was a device to impose Anglo-centric images and values upon hapless immigrants. An impression reinforced by the rise of the Americanization, quote-unquote, movement in response to the new polyglot immigration. Americanization programs, benign in intent, sought to expedite assimilation by offering immigrants special education in language, citizenship, and American history. The outbreak of war in 1914 gave Americanization a more coercive edge. Even presidents, as friendly to immigrants as Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, worried whether in crisis hyphenated, quote unquote, Americans might not be more loyal to the old country than to their adopted land. We have no 50-50 allegiance in this country, Theodore Roosevelt said 2 years later. Quote, either a man is an American and nothing else, or he is not an American at all, unquote. He condemned Americans who saw the world from the standpoint of another nation. Quote, "We Americans are children of the crucible," unquote, TR said. Quote, "The crucible does not do its work unless it turns out those cast into it in one national mold," unquote. And let me just say that, this is why I preface this part one of the Disuniting of America with the racist things that presidents say. See, today, that would be considered racially insensitive. Now, I'm going to finish this thought up. Across America, now, this is from page 46. Across America, minorities proclaimed their pride and demanded their rights. Women, the one minority that in America constituted a numerical majority, sought political and economic equality. Jews gained new solidarity from the Holocaust and then from the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel. Changes in the immigration law dramatically increased the numbers arriving from Hispanic and Asian lands. And following the general example, they asserted their own prerogatives. American Indians mobilized to reclaim rights in lands long since appropriated by the white man. Their spokesman even rejected the historical designation in which Indians had taken deserved pride and renamed themselves Native Americans. Michael Novak, an early influential theorist of multiculturalism, wrote, "The rise of the unmeltable ethnics," that's the title. "Growing up in America," quote unquote, Novak said, "has been an assault upon my sense of worthiness." And to improve his self-esteem, he affirmed the need for a politics of identity against the conception of America as a nation of individuals. Novak hailed what he called the new ethnic politics, which he said asserts that groups can structure the rules and goals and procedures of American life. The passion for quote-unquote roots was reinforced by the third generation effect formulated in Hanson's law, named after Marcus Lee Hanson, the great pioneer in immigration history. Quote, "What the son wishes to forget, the grandson wishes to remember," unquote. It was reinforced too, and powerfully, by the waning American optimism about the nation's prospects. For 2 centuries, Americans have been confident that life would be better for their children than it was for them. In their exuberant youth, Americans had disdained the past, and as John Quincy Adams urged, look forward to their posterity rather than backward to their ancestors. Amid forebodings and national decline, Americans now began to look forward less and backwards more. The rising cult of ethnicity was a symptom of decreasing confidence in the American future. And here you have it. You see, we are so divided now that we really don't, nationally speaking, have all that much hope in the future. Hence, part of the reason for the opioid crisis that is ravishing the country, and for the wholesale embracing of narcotics. You see, we are, or, even you can fit in the legalization of marijuana with that. You see, there is a malaise, as President Jimmy Carter once put it, that has settled on most people, wherein there is no real pride in the American future, or there is no real pride that, to put it in another more visceral way, there is no real pride in the great accomplishment of having a future that everyone can truly believe in. Everybody in the 60s, let's say, that was the point of demarcation. In the 60s, people had hope. You see, that's the great distinction between now and that mid-section of the 20th century. Here we are at the end of a integrated, at least in terms of superficially, integrated American history. And yet we are still discombobulated, fatigued, and, to put it flatly, disappointed with what has come about. Because things have not gotten any better. And the reason why is because people don't believe that the problems that are before us, racism and the basic economic problems floating around, the debate about entitlements and what the government should and should not do, and what should be the living standards. We're going to get into this in the next video, part 2, where I will be reading an analysis on poverty. All those things have not been resolved. Here we have been talking about these things for 50 years. We have heard presidents come and go talking about we're going to finally have an education system that we can be proud of. Nothing has happened. Healthcare has only gotten more complicated, convoluted, and expensive. We have no serious belief, even in terms of what has become now black politicians, even solving the inherent problems that have come through the various generations by no other source but the color line, more commonly known as racism. But you see, these kinds of things have led to the hyphenated American, the pride of, obviously, our grandparents had it better because they had more focus. They had certainly, see, the nostalgia is, and that's the other line of demarcation, which he Schlesinger accurately pinpoints. You see, this generation does not necessarily look forward, it looks back. And that is a serious problem. We look back too much in nostalgia and not forward because we have no confidence, really, that the major problems are even going to be solved. And that the bleakness that has come about with the technological revolution is never going to be adequately harmonized with what we need as human beings, and that is to feel valued and important. Well, if you're going to give the machine more dominance, that is not going to happen. So too we have these contours. And that is why we must understand the crisis wherein the disuniting of America comes from. And I'm going to put my period there and rejoin you in part 2. And I am not going to forget to ask you for donations. We need to show that people have interest in these topics and these shows. And so I ask you to, in this holiday and Christmas season, put a few dollars into my PayPal account. And that is paypal.me/ETHAN905. Again, that is paypal.me/ETHAN905. Please be generous so that we can continue to have this good conversation and this in-depth conversation about the crisis that is disuniting America.